Thesis before lunch. This is Joel. We've been working all year on Joel's confidence to bring him up a little bit out of his shell. Just kidding. But he's got a great thesis. These are his words. He says, I would like to thank God for helping me throughout this thesis, my parents for always checking in on me, Mr. Wade and Miss May for being patient with my procrastination, and my advisor, Mr. Braun, for his amazing inputs. His title is Parents Left on Red, Why Adolescents Growing Dependence on Smartphones is Hurting Families. All right, give me a couple of seconds to set up the timer. I'll tell you when you can start. All right, you can start when ready.
9.5 hours. That was the number I saw when I checked my average screen time one night. See, at first, I didn't really think it was that bad. But the more I thought about it, the harder it was to ignore. Thinking back to when I first got a phone in 8th grade, up until now, I started to realize a pattern. After every argument, after every awkward interaction, and in any moment of discomfort, my first instinct wasn't to deal with it up front. It was to reach for my phone and scroll. I realized that those 9.5 hours weren't just me spending my free time. There were conversations I never had, moments I didn't notice, and opportunities I completely ignored. The surprising part wasn't the number itself, but how normal it felt. 9.5 hours every day since I was 13 came out to over 16,000 hours of screen time. Somehow, this glowing rectangle stripped away 2 years of my life. But time lost rarely feels like something being taken. No heads up when it leaves, but no way of getting it back once it's gone. Instead, time slips away, hidden in the small repeated choices that feel insignificant in the moment. Until one day, the void created by those small choices isn't so easy to ignore. Now, this divide doesn't just affect the user, it bleeds into their family. Conversations grow short, moments shared become moments apart. Sure, the physical presence remains, but the emotional connections begin to fade. Slowly but surely eroding adolescents' relationships with their families, leaving words unspoken and bonds fraying. With every swipe and scroll building silent walls. Now, smartphones have seemingly become an everyday necessity for most. But before they were known as the doorway to infinite knowledge, the original product was nothing compared to what we have today. The earliest versions of the smartphone dates back to 1994. It was called the Simon Personal Communicator. It had a touchscreen, email address book, notes, calendar, and a calling feature. Now, this version of the smartphone introduced the idea that phones could do more than just communicate. A decade later, in the early 2000s, the internet browsing, wireless email access, and messaging were enhanced by Nokia and BlackBerry. During this era, the Ericsson R380 was created and became known as one of the first true smartphones, and also becoming highly popular among business workers as it changed workplace communication. In 2007, Apple released the first iPhone, introduced by Steve Jobs. Now, this was the era where smartphones became focused on entertainment, third-party applications, and user experience. However, during the smartphone's explosion in popularity, it marked the beginning of a new problem that society just refuses to face. As the technology of smartphones continued to develop, the influence it had on human behavior became increasingly apparent, from being a tool of convenience to a source of dependency. Fast forward to the 2020s with the development of AI and short-form content from apps like YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram, studies show that the younger generation had a deepened addiction over the time, leading to a decrease in attention span. For many, this was the final straw that intensified disconnection and conflict within the household, which leads to why this thesis focuses on a less discussed symptom of the overuse of smartphones, the breakdown of a healthy family dynamic. And by family dynamic, what I really mean are the patterns of interaction and relationship between parent and child, which shape how a family functions and influences an individual's emotions, well-being, and behavior. By shining a light on why the overuse of smartphones is hurting this generation, we might be able to change the normalization of this overlooked addiction. Which is why parents must regulate the use of adolescent smartphones to build a healthy family dynamic for 3 reasons. Smartphones replace in-person communication with algorithmic digital engagement. They undermine parental authority and escalate family conflict. First, I want to address the cause of smartphone addiction for adolescents. And after extensive research, I found that smartphone platforms are intentionally designed to monopolize attention, making it difficult for them to stay emotionally present and weakening the parent-child relationship. Smartphone platforms can easily be overlooked as just tools, but they are deliberately tailored to monopolize adolescent attention. You see, smartphone apps systematically exploit neurological vulnerability to keep adolescents hooked. According to the research for the National Institute of Mental Health, adolescents are in the midst of developing their prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is responsible for 2 things: impulse control and decision making. Not to mention, it's one of the last regions of the brain that fully matures. As a result, adolescents rely heavily on an emotional and reward-driven system, making impulsive reactions more frequent and reactive to instant gratification. This combination of a highly reactive prefrontal cortex and an environment that is meant to maintain attention makes it hard for adolescents to stay emotionally present. But how do these apps exploit this vulnerability? And if you think about it, majority of the applications you use have personalized algorithms. Personalized algorithms continuously build content based on adolescent behavior, creating highly tailored feeds that prolong user engagement. A study published by the International Journal of Environmental Science describes this with a term called personalization pull, where algorithms are too relevant for users to ignore, leading to what psychologists call an endless scroll trance, where adolescents have been reported to enter a state of losing track of time due to how absorbing the algorithmic feed truly is. When the digital world overstimulates adolescents, they naturally disassociate from the real world. Now, aside from personalized algorithms, smartphones feature notifications that consistently interrupt real-life interactions, which teach adolescents to normalize partial presence and divided attention. Every buzz, ping, or vibration pulls attention. Over time, users overly checking their phones becomes normal, even if it breaks the flow of communication. This behavior wires adolescents to prioritize digital updates over real people, making family members feel undervalued or ignored. Because notifications constantly pull teens back into the digital world, real-life communication seems to feel less rewarding and easier to ignore. Parental authority is an extremely important part to the structure of a family. However, with the rise of smartphones, they started to alter the balance of the structure by introducing a digital environment that is oftentimes outside the parent's control. Therefore, smartphones undermine parental authoritative ability by shifting validation, discipline, and autonomy into a constant private digital environment. One of the first recognizable signs is that smartphones expose adolescents to constant peer evaluation, causing them to prioritize external validation. Social media platforms have a major influence on adolescent behavior and decision-making. This is because social media fosters a sense of identity and self through social comparison and feedback from peers. Adolescents are the most vulnerable and susceptible to the influence of social media because it capitalizes on the human tendency to seek identity from external sources, especially at this age. Second, constant smartphone access allows adolescents to disengage from disciplinary interactions, preventing the communication of mutual recognition required for parental authority to function properly. Researchers Kuhar and Reiter in the field of psychology and youth studies found that parental authority relies on 2 main components. First, parental authority is a dynamic process that builds through everyday interactions, through communication and understanding one another to negotiate certain rules and the intentions behind certain boundaries. And second, authority depends on legitimacy. Adolescents must recognize authority and its influence in order for it to be effective. But constant smartphone access can weaken parental authority by preventing an interaction that is needed for adolescents to recognize, internalize, and respond to the guidance of the parents. Lastly, a lack of supervision grants adolescents premature autonomy by giving them unrestricted access to digital spaces. Personal autonomy, or the ability to make a decision for yourself, is a privilege that needs to be earned gradually through showing traits of responsibility. However, smartphones interrupt this process because they allow instant autonomy with constant access to the internet and privacy. Now, the reason why this is a big problem is because it actively disrupts the hierarchy of a family. Parental authority has been shown to collapse when adolescents gain independence before self-regulation. Now, after discussing the mechanisms behind why adolescents become addicted to smartphones, as well as how the addiction affects parental authority, the last thing I want to address is the unhealthy conflict that happens in a family dynamic. Hence, the last reason why parents must regulate smartphone use is that smartphones disrupt sleep patterns, hinder empathy, and encourage child conflict avoidance, which builds tension and leads to an increase in family conflict. First, smartphones disrupt adolescent sleep patterns, causing emotional instability, which increases conflict within the household. Sleep is so important, especially for adolescents who are in the middle of developing emotional regulation, cognitive function, and healthy communication skills. Without proper sleep, adolescents become more irritable and emotionally unstable, deeming them less capable of managing stress and conflict. Research by John M. Twang found that high levels of smartphone use is directly correlated with sleep deprivation and irregular sleep patterns, causing depression, anxiety, and emotional distress. When adolescents consistently lose time for rest to smartphones, they are more likely to be emotionally reactive and irritable, which can lead to a withdrawal and less responsive behavior. As a result, everyday conversations and disagreements within the household are intensified because of emotional exhaustion. The adolescent's ability to communicate then falls behind. In addition to that, digital communication reduces adolescents' ability to develop empathy by removing exposure to real-life emotional cues. The importance of adolescents learning how to read real-life cues cannot be stressed enough. So when smartphones strip away necessary elements of communication, such as tone of voice, facial expressions, and body language, it makes emotional interpretation far more difficult. A cross-cultural study in China and Germany supports this. They found that individuals who show higher levels of smartphone use consistently reported lower empathy and poorer social well-being. This suggests that high levels of smartphone and internet use are directly associated with a worsened ability to understand the feelings of others. This makes As a result, adolescents will struggle to understand parents' emotions and intentions during hard conversations. This makes misunderstandings more frequent and more difficult to resolve, which gradually weakens trust and emotional closeness. And finally, smartphone overuse teaches adolescents to avoid conflict rather than seek resolution. Conflict between parents and adolescents is a completely normal and necessary part of development because it allows teenagers to learn how to regulate emotions, communicate effectively, and resolve disagreements in a healthy manner. However, instead of engaging in these difficult conversations, adolescents increasingly turn to their phones as a way to escape discomfort. Utilizing smartphones as an immediate distraction can allow confrontation avoidance, rather than working through the problem at hand. Research by developmental psychologists found that adolescents who rely on avoidance during conflict experience an increase in negative emotions and behavioral issues. On the other hand, those who engage in open discussions develop a healthier adjustment to the problem. As a result, opportunities to develop conflict resolution skills and to have other important conversations are left unfinished or completely dismissed. Now, critics may argue that the family relationship depends more on the family environment rather than adolescent screen time. In fact, in many cases, a healthy family environment produces healthy family relationships between members. Having said that, this argument completely overlooks that excessive smartphone use still acts as a disruptive force, even with families considered to have a healthy family dynamic. No matter how strong a family environment may be, it will never be immune. Smartphone addiction directly reduces face-to-face interaction while encouraging avoidance of real-life responsibilities and emotional engagement. During these moments of shared activity, adolescents often resist putting away their phones, which leaves others feeling ignored and unseen. During these moments, the smartphone becomes a competing voice that constantly interrupts parents. And research supports this. A meta-analysis by the American Psychological Association examined over 290,000 children. They found that higher screen use is linked to risks of anxiety, depression, aggression, and hyperactivity. They also found that adolescents who experience these issues are likely to go back to their phone as a way of coping. This creates a bidirectional relationship. This is extremely important because family relationships are built on emotional connections as foundation. When smartphones disrupt emotional development, they start to weaken those relationships over time. Opportunities for connection are replaced with silence, and physical presence no longer guarantees engagement. So smartphones don't simply exist within the family dynamic, they interfere with the very emotional presence that is meant to sustain it, weakening connections regardless of how supportive the family may seem. Another argument that critics claim is that the distancing between adolescents and parents is a natural part of development, regardless of screen time use. In fact, according to Erik Erikson's theory of identity versus role confusion, adolescents are expected to explore their independence, question authority, and gradually rely less on parents for identity formation. Some level of distancing is therefore normal within a family dynamic. However, although this developmental shift is expected, excessive smartphone use has been shown to accelerate and intensify this process in unhealthy ways. Research demonstrates that the gap between what adolescents report about their emotional well-being and what parents perceive continues to widen among smartphone users, while remaining relatively stable among those without a smartphone. Now, this growing discrepancy suggests that smartphones contribute to a breakdown in mutual understanding between parent and children. As a result, what should be a gradual and manageable transition towards independence becomes a faster, more fragmented separation, making it more difficult for families to maintain emotional closeness and effective communication. Now, throughout this thesis, we've discussed why parents must regulate adolescent smartphone use for 3 reasons. Smartphones replace in-person communication with algorithmic digital engagement. They undermine parental authority and escalate family conflict. We explored the mechanisms behind smartphone addiction, starting from neurological vulnerability to personalized algorithms and notifications that are meant to maintain attention. Then we talked about how excessive smartphone use weakens parental authority by shifting validation, communication, and decision-making into a digital environment that is oftentimes outside the parent's control. And last, we went over how smartphone overuse escalates conflict through sleep deprivation, weakened empathy, and conflict avoidance. Smartphone technology has clearly shown to influence users beyond its practical use. And by now, it's pretty clear that passive awareness alone isn't going to solve this issue. So a fix that I suggest for parents are establishing phone-free environments during key family interactions. This could be during meals or during conversations. This way, face-to-face communication is restored, and emotional closeness during important moments is kept. However, in the end, if we continue to allow this overlooked addiction to go unnoticed, we risk substituting digital engagement. We risk substituting real-life interactions with digital engagement. This risks becoming the modern, This risk is becoming the modern family structure nowadays, and that's a problem. The most significant change is not that adolescents use smartphones, but the presence itself is what becomes the divide. Sure, the home remains the same, but the presence, the attention, and the conversations will cease to exist. The last thing I want for society is a future where families share a home, yet live like strangers. So if there's one thing I could tell my younger self, is to put down the phone, look up into the eyes of the people that care about you, and make sure you don't scroll past the moments that truly matter. Thank you.
All right, good job, Joel. Our panelists today are Miss Abigail and Miss Joe. We'll start with Miss Abigail.
Hi, Joel. How are
Hi,
you?
Miss. Not good.
I'm so proud looking at you here now as your Bible teacher. So, yeah, your thesis actually gave me a lot of insights, and your research highlights how smartphones have evolved from a simple communication tools in the 90s into devices that have become deeply integrated into our everyday lives.
Right.
So, however, I have some questions for you. Are you ready?
Of course, of course.
So, yeah, why did you choose this topic?
So, as I mentioned before in the beginning, there was like this random day where I was checking my average screen time. I realized that it was like pretty high. It's ranging from 7 hours to 11 hours. And throughout the week and throughout the days, sometimes it goes higher and sometimes it goes lower. And then I also started to realize that if I spend 8 hours sleeping, 8 hours at school, and 8 hours doing nothing, that means I have like, or the other 8 hours, like when I'm not doing nothing, on my phone. And so that tells me that I'm not being really emotionally present during moments that should be important, especially in my high school years. And there's been a lot of times where my friends tell me to get off my phone because I like to doom scroll a lot whenever I'm eating with them or I'm in the car. And then I'm like realizing, oh, this might be a problem. And so that's why I chose this topic because I wanted to know deeper on what these problems are and the consequences behind them.
I guess you're maturing, right?
In a way, in a way.
So yeah. So but let's be realistic, Joel. So yeah, handphone. It is a necessity, right? Especially for a teenager like you. So how would we actually regulate? You use the word regulate, right? Is it the same with control to control?
No, regulation is not parents controlling. Instead, it's a mutual connection between parents and adolescents. So basically, regulation looks like intentional boundaries. So parents must explain certain rules and the intention behind those boundaries so that adolescents can recognize, oh wait, you're right about these rules, and actually I agree with them. And next, parents have to use guided explanation and discussions actively. So it's not a rule that is said once. It needs to be like, oh, like over time. If your kid is like shifting towards the wrong side, you need to still, hey, this is the wrong side. This is the rules. These are the boundaries, and it's for your own good. So they need to be like active in that, as well as gradual autonomy. So adolescents are in the middle of like a really chaotic stage. They want to do a lot of things. They have a lot of passion, but like because their prefrontal cortex is not fully developed, they can't be really trusted in a sense. And so that's where gradual autonomy comes in, where parents have to, after adolescents show traits of responsibility, parents should also be less controlling and recognize, okay, my kid is maturing, it's time to let them be a bit more independent. And yes, that's what regulation in a healthy manner looks like.
Okay, so how would you advise a parent, for example, a parent like me who is 13-year-old and using handphone? Mom, this is for our homework. The school actually asked us to have a group, a WEA, so that we can communicate about our project and our assignments. So yeah, how would I regulate the usage of handphone?
As I mentioned before, I think one of the best ways is establishing phone-free environments, um, especially like defining certain times and moments where smartphone use shouldn't be used. And that's like, for example, I said in my speech, during conversations or during meals. It's because during meals and conversations, it's time to connect with your family, and you shouldn't be on your phone. Phones do this really good thing, or really bad thing, I guess, when they're in your field of view, your attention is divided between what's happening on your phone and what the person in front of you is talking about, even if you're not using your phone. And so that's really dangerous. And can you repeat your question? I'm sorry.
Yeah. How would you advise
Oh,
parent like
yeah.
me? Yeah.
Phone-free environments is like the best suggestion I can give.
Thank you, Joel. So yeah, another question. So Joel, what age-appropriate smartphones would you actually recommend to children or teenager? What age-appropriate should I give phone?
Oh, so the question is like, at what age are
Yeah,
they
yeah, yeah.
like showing responsibility enough to give them a phone?
Yes.
So I would say it's different across different families, right? There's no like one age where they're guaranteed to be responsible enough to have a phone, but 95% of adolescents actually do have a phone. So it's not when they get a phone, I would say, is like the main problem, but that regulation in order, like you need regulation when they do have a phone, and that's like the main problem I'm talking about, basically. So not necessarily about the age, but that regulation is needed.
Okay, let's go back to rules. Rules.
Right.
How would I create rule that will actually not make conflict between parent and adolescents?
Right. This is where open discussions come into play. So basically, parents got to listen to what their children are saying, and children got to recognize parental authority and respect their parents and what they're saying. So it's a mutual connection between both parties that find an agreement or like middle ground, and that's the best way to avoid conflict. But I'm arguing here that smartphones reduce face-to-face connection and interaction, so they don't even have these conversations in the first place, and that's like the problem I'm talking about.
Okay, so is there any biblical worldview that we can draw from your thesis?
A biblical worldview. Um, I would say Ephesians 6:4 is a pretty good verse that you should look at. It says, "Fathers, don't provoke anger through your children, but bring them up in training and instruction within the Lord." So basically, I would say the biblical worldview you should take away is that active regulation and active discipline is important, and these constant daily interactions should be like productive in a sense. So yeah, that's my response.
Thank you, Joel.
All right, Miss Joe.
Hi, Joel.
Hi, miss.
Okay, thank you very much for your presentation. I think Mr. Wei does not need to encourage to be more confident, because I think you're very confident.
Yeah,
Yep.
Thank you.
Okay. Yep. So very good job on your presentation. Now on to the questions.
Oh no.
Okay. All right. So all right. Let's start with this. You mentioned in one part of your thesis that adolescents need an emotional and reward-driven system,
Yeah.
and so on and so on. Now, if let's say we don't have phones, right? Because you said that phones give the instant gratification and so forth. Now, let's say we don't have the phones. What would be a substitute for that?
A substitute for phones? That's a pretty good question. And it's not something I've thought about actually because of how integrated phones are in everyday life. There's a lot of stores that don't accept cash. There are a lot of times where you can't like communicate with other people without your phones because they're like somewhere else. And so I guess using other pieces of technology besides phone, which is like email on your laptop, that's like the best way I could, I guess, substitute phones, because like phones are really hard to substitute because of how important they are becoming in everyday life.
So if you were to say that, okay, so phones give the immediate gratification, and then it gives because adolescents rely heavily on emotional and reward-driven system, etc., and phones can satisfy you with that. Now, let's say with a phone-free environment that you were suggesting, how would the parents equip their children with the need of reward-driven system and instant gratification?
Oh, so I'm not saying instant gratification is needed. I'm actually saying that's dangerous. So instant gratification comes because when adolescents scroll online, they get flooded with a lot of information, and that releases a lot of dopamine. And so I'm saying that's pretty dangerous. Can you repeat your question? I'm sorry.
So how would the parents equip their children? Like, what would they use instead then? Like, in that time of phone-free environment, right? Then how would the parents, quote unquote, entertain their children, maybe?
I feel like we shouldn't entertain the idea that that parents need to give instant gratification, or they need to give like I would say fast responses. But like we should normalize these conversations and just being physically present and mentally present, right? With phones, you can be physically present, but you can also be mentally absent at the same time. So conversations don't hit as hard, and the true meaning of the conversations and the interactions can be misunderstood, but also are not fully sent or received by adolescents.
I like your answer.
Thank you.
Okay, next question. In all of your proofs, your 3 points, it's written that smartphones, let's say smartphone platforms are intentionally designed, and then smartphones undermine parental authority, and smartphones cause misunderstandings, etc.
Yeah.
So, are you saying that smartphones are the main issue, or yeah, can you just clarify on that?
So I would say the main issue is that smartphones are actively accelerating and intensifying processes, and they become a catalyst for already existing problems to become bigger ones later. And so that's the problem.
So is it the use or the overuse of the smartphones, or is it the unregulated smartphone
right,
use?
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that would be the problem as well. Unregulated smartphone use is it's really dangerous because it comes out of habit and automation. So I would say if you don't like ask yourself when you use your phone, why am I on my phone? And the answer becomes, oh, I'm bored or I'm stressed or like I have nothing better to do. That's where it becomes an addiction and that's where it becomes a problem. So yeah.
Okay. And then you also mentioned that smartphone platforms are intentionally designed to monopolize adolescents' attention, making it difficult for them to stay emotionally present at home and weakening the parent-child relationship. That's your first proof. Now, wouldn't that mean that it's the smartphone platforms? Okay, in this case, what do you mean by platforms? Are you saying
Smartphone platforms, I'm basically just nitpicking at the design of smartphones because tech companies and like these developers have an incentive to keep user engagement. And so that's why, oh, not incentive. They want to keep user engagement, so they have an incentive to prolong user engagement. And they make apps look like highly accessible, make instant gratification a lot easier. And so, yeah.
So then would you say that instead of the smartphone itself, would you say that it's the problem is with the smartphone platforms instead?
I would say it's still smartphones because one of the characteristics of smartphones is that they're highly portable. You can bring them anywhere. So because they're highly portable, it makes them different from like the TV or other pieces of technology like laptops because it's always with you every point of the day. So that's where the problem lies.
Okay, probably one of my last questions. I think this smartphone addiction is not limited to only adolescents, right? I think
Right, of
everyone in
course.
this room, or most if not all, right, are very much addicted to smartphones. Now, if in the house you have parents who are extremely busy, especially also with their phones, and so to equip their children, they also give smartphones to their children, right? Now, how would you counter that? Like the parents themselves are busy now, the children will therefore be busy with their phones.
So this all comes down to like what type of parenting style that families have. But I also want to argue that parents need to be a role model for the children. They need to show example and lead by example so that, because like adolescents are really good at imitating what they see. And so if they always see parents who are always on their phones and are always busy and they themselves don't spend much time interacting, then it's going to be mirrored by their children. And so, yeah, parents need to be a good example for their children.
Do you have more questions? Yeah. Yep.
Okay. Then continuing to probably what Ms. Abby already asked you, when do parents start to, in your conclusion, in your solution to start a phone-free environment? Then when should parents start? So let's say the children or their adolescent child is given phone, well, let's say at 14, like you were. Now, maybe when he was first given the phone, he didn't immediately get addicted to his phone. But then it grows as years go by. So when would be the appropriate or the right time for parents to, okay, let's do phone-free environment, and how should they do it?
Ideally, these should be established before they get a phone. In a similar way, I'd say regulation is like a vaccine. It only works before the sickness, it only works because of preparation and not while the emergency is happening. But at the same time, just because your kid is addicted right now and you haven't had those conversations, it doesn't mean you do nothing about it. Right now is the perfect time, as soon as possible, to talk about this with your children and have these conversations, these hard conversations. So yeah.
Okay, I have a question or two. I want to go back to something that was already said.
Sorry.
That's okay. Or something similar. So just the other day, I'm at a restaurant. Miss Denise and I are at a restaurant, and what we see is a family of 5, 3 kids and 2 parents. And this is real life, right? The kids are trying to play, they're having fun. They're not looking at phones. It's the parents who are scrolling the whole time, not paying attention to their children at all. And so my question is, you've addressed adolescents in this thesis, but isn't this thesis for everybody? And maybe the follow-up to that is, how would your thesis be any different if you were talking to parents instead of children about their use of smartphones?
I would say my thesis wouldn't be too much different because I would say change starts from what parents do. So like these conversations, these interactions need to be started by parents. And like I said before, parents need to be a good role model so that their children can follow. And so I would still talk about these problems because I would say in my thesis, I talked about a discrepancy in the beginning where parents and adolescents recognize their addiction, but they don't do anything about it because they don't understand the consequences behind why this is a problem in the first place. And so what I listed out are the problems and the consequences with smartphone addiction. And so I would say my thesis wouldn't change much because I'm still targeting it towards families and parents.
Okay. And now here's the question, Joel.
Oh no.
What are you personally doing about this in your own personal life? Has your screen time gone down, or what's going on?
This is a great question. So I've actually, for like the past 3 weeks, I've downloaded what's called a minimalistic app, I would say. And basically it changes your phone to be less like advertised driven and like algorithm driven by making it black and white and no apps are visible, only words. And I've actually deleted my highly used apps, which were like TikTok and Instagram, which were 7 hours and like 6 hours each. And by deleting that, my smartphone addiction, I would say, has subsided. And I found a really big decrease from like 7 to 11 hours a day to only 2 to 3. So
that's really good.
Something
My
I'm
next
proud of.
question was going to be about apps, because I know there is something I read about just the other day that will turn your smartphone essentially into a dumb phone, where you can text if
Right.
you need to, but you don't have all this other distraction going on.
Right.
And so would you recommend that to others or something like it?
I would recommend it, but I wouldn't say it's the only option that's available in order to become less addicted to your screen, because it's not always going to work for everyone. There's also there's dumb phones, but there's also like, yeah, that's my answer. Forget what I said at the end. At the end.
Okay, good. Well, your time is up. You've done great. Good job, Joel. Okay, we will meet friends and family, panelists, and advisors over here at the backdrop for photos. And then